Crash has had a bit of a rocky history ever since his jump to the wrong game. I don't think it's very controversial to say Crash isn't exactly known very well for his games that came out after the original trilogy, and his handheld outings are talked about even less. In a previous episode, I covered the Crash games that came out for the Game Boy Advance, which admittedly I at least had vague knowledge of. In the case of the Nintendo DS, though, I'm going in blind. I have absolutely no idea what I'm in for, and come to think of it, maybe there's a reason I never hear anyone talk about those games. Today, let's take a look at the Crash Bandicoot games that came out for the Nintendo DS.
Like in previous videos, I'm gonna go in order of release. The mid-2000s weren't exactly Crash's golden years, and he was in a really weird spot at the time, so I've got a feeling this is gonna be quite the mixed bag. Hey, real quick, if you like the video, consider subscribing. About half the views on the entire channel come from people who aren't subbed, and it actually helps out way more than you'd probably expect, and it's also the best way to keep up if you want to see more. With that out of the way, let's look at some Crash games. I wish I could start this off with something positive, but Crash sure put his best foot forward with his first release on the DS. Brace yourselves for this first one because, oh boy. Back in 2006, the first Crash game to come out on the handheld was Crash Boom Bang, essentially a Mario Party clone published by Sierra, whose name actually appears on all Crash titles released for the DS. I'm not entirely sure how that whole publishing situation works since the game is technically listed as being published by Vivendi Games, who owns Sierra, but honestly, it's not all that important. What is important though is that this was the first time a Japanese developer took the reins on a Crash game, and who better to take on such a task, but a company probably most known for quality being a roll of the dice. Dimps, the company responsible for such prestigious titles as Street Fighter IV and Sonic the Hedgehog 4. I know these games are from a different era, but it serves as a good example of what we're dealing with here. Now, Dimps has been responsible for some good games and some really bad ones, but out of every bad game Dimps has ever been involved with, I think this one might be the worst. Like I said, it's a straight up Mario Party ripoff, only it's much less on par with Mario Party and much more akin to something like Sonic Shuffle. I'm only one person, so I can't play the multiplayer modes, but I will, however, be able to play the adventure mode. More or less, the adventure mode just kind of adds a story into the mix for no other reason than to give context to why you're playing a bunch of these board game stages. I'm sure most of you don't actually care about the story, but basically, there's this rich dude named Viscount who's looking for this MacGuffin called the Super Big Power Crystal, so he makes up a fake competition called the World Cannonball Race to trick Crash and the gang into finding it for him under the guise of it being a tournament or whatever. Nobody cares. They didn't really try writing the story, so I'm not going to really try explaining it. The point is, this is a party game that pretty much just boils down to needing to play a bunch of really terrible minigames. The stages themselves, I can't for the life of me figure out. The goal is a lot less clear than it is in something like Mario Party, and I pretty much just roll the dice over and over and play minigames over and over until the course eventually ends. I know there's supposed to be some goal involved where you or your opponents uncover key items to end the stage, but in the first stage, there's an end goal. The game doesn't do a good job of explaining most things, and this extends to the minigames in like the worst way possible. The game does close to nothing to explain its rules, like this horse racing game, for example. It tells you to tap the horse to fill the meter to make it speed up, but it only ever seems to speed up once you completely fill it. Problem is, once you get the speed boost, the horse slows to a crawl and it has to cool down. There's no amount of tapping the screen that allowed me to win a race no matter how many times I tried. There's also these Atmosphere minigames where it tells you to slide the stylus up the screen to rev up speed, and it literally doesn't work. And I know because whatever opponent I'm up against goes like 50,000 miles an hour and I don't. So either the controls are borked or the game isn't explaining what to actually do. It seems like most of these games' biggest issue is that they're bogged down by really unresponsive touchscreen controls. Not that they'd be fun otherwise, but they could at least be bearable if they were functional. I mean, look at this one where all I need to do is pick up pieces of this car and put it together to match the example. Now look what happens. 90% of the time, Crash refuses to pick parts up, and when he does, another 90% of the time, instead of the part actually going where it's supposed to, the game registers it as not placed in the right spot, I guess, and it respawns back where it was. That's basically the entire experience of playing this game. I played for about 2 hours and I was getting so irritated to the point where I felt like I needed to go take a break. If that's not telling about the quality of this game, I don't know what is. Crash Boom Bang is complete and utter garbage. It really has nothing to do with Crash and is just a terrible, badly programmed minigame collection with a Crash skin. Oh, and also Cortex is f***ing white. Alright, next up we have Crash of the Titans. In my previous video on the GBA Crash games, I covered the Game Boy Advance version, and until now, that was the only version I had played. Despite these games being very different in execution, the core idea is the same. Now, since I haven't played the console version, I only have the GBA one to compare it to, but from what I can see and from what I've heard, this plays much more in line with the console version. It's obviously different, but whereas the GBA version is a 2D side-scroller, this one is a 3D beat-em-up. I might as well start off by talking about the one thing I will give this game credit for. Now, maybe after playing as much garbage as I have, I'm a little bit easier to please, but anytime I see a fully 3D game on the DS, it still impresses me. Despite being 3D capable, many games on the DS were 2D, but considering the DS was able to pull off something like Mario 64 DS, it's inevitable that some developers are going to do what they can to take advantage of the fact that the console could do 3D. And in the case of Crash of the Titans, instead of going the obvious route and doing a 2D reimagining of the GBA version, they actually tried to mimic the gameplay of the console title. Okay, now that I've gotten that small amount of praise over with, here's the low-quality FMV that plays during the intro. Now, I don't blame them for rendering this stuff out to save on resources, but what I do blame them for is the screen tearing here. Yep, that's not just the footage, it looks like that on an actual DS. I can't believe this made it on store shelves, because if this is your first impression upon booting the game up, it doesn't exactly get your hopes up very high, which I guess is fitting, because this game is like the textbook definition of mediocre. So the game is split up into different islands that house a few different types of stages. There's the main ones, the touchscreen controlled stages, which are much shorter. There's also levels where you play as Nina Cortex, and you also face off against whatever boss is on each respective island. Crash of the Titans' main mechanic is the ability to use Aku Aku to take control of enemies. Now, I mentioned this about the GBA version, but I really do not like this mechanic for a few simple reasons. They are way less enjoyable to control than Crash, they move slower, and overall are just more clunky. But they also are much stronger than Crash at base level, and taking control of an enemy causes the enemy to take damage instead of Crash. As long as you're currently possessing an enemy, Crash can't get hurt. So it's way less fun to control enemies, but also there's way too much incentive to not do so. They basically built the game around a really unfun mechanic, which they then encourage you to utilize every chance you get, and that mechanic is pretty much the only thing of note to even say about it. These are really boring levels with little to no platforming, and you basically just mash the attack button at any enemies that come your way till you make it to the end of each stage. Although, you do need to make sure you nab the crystal in each stage, or else the boss won't spawn even after you've beaten the stages. I found this out the hard way. The other stage types I mentioned are these weird, almost racing kind of stages where you have to control Crash in various different ways using the stylus, and you do kind of need the stylus because I tried using my finger and it wasn't really working out too well. These are honestly kind of hit or miss. Some of them aren't too bad, but others are really annoying to control, and I feel like there's no reason these needed to be included other than because DS. They're all pretty short though, so I won't complain too much. They just feel dumpy and unnecessary. This game is extremely short though, so I guess they needed all the padding they could get. There's also these short stages where you play as Nina and need to shoot a bunch of cute animals to transform them into enemies. The stages don't last very long, and you basically just need to walk around and shoot X amount of enemies, occasionally using the touchscreen to recharge your laser. Now, the bosses in this game are pretty uneventful as well. You take control of an enemy to attack the boss, and there's supposed to be a strategy and reflexes involved, but in practice, you can pretty much just spam the attack button and abuse your iframes till the bosses go down. Like I said about the GBA version, this may have had an okay concept, but in practice, this game is just a slog. I guess it wouldn't be all that terrible for a young kid to play since it's really not all that difficult. Part of me feels like maybe I would have gotten at least something out of this when I was like 7, but really there's no reason anyone needs to play this other than morbid curiosity. I won't say it's completely terrible, it's not broken or anything, it's just not good. And also, as everyone probably knows by now, they use that weird Crash redesign where he has tribal tattoos, but then also this image is in the game, so I really don't think the team was communicating all that well. You know, I may have spoken too soon and taken Crash of the Titans for granted. 1 year later, a handheld port of Crash Mind Over Mutant was released, and despite being a newer game, it's actually a step back. You see, Mind Over Mutant has the same mechanic from Crash of the Titans, but this version they decided to go with a 2D playstyle rather than the 3D nature of its counterpart. Funny enough, it's actually much closer to the GBA version of Crash of the Titans in that regard. Basically, imagine that game, only worse. For some reason, they still went with 3D models for Crash and the enemies, despite all the background elements and stage assets being 2D, though that reason is probably just because it took less time. What we have here is one of the laziest 2D platformers I've ever played. For 80% of the game, you pretty much just have to walk right. There's barely any thought or variation put into the level design, almost no unique ideas or mechanics that change up the levels in any way, and although the stages are all littered with enemies, Wumpa Fruit, and orbs to collect, there's little to no reason to actually collect them, and it's far more time efficient to just make a beeline to the end of each stage. Now, when you possess a mutant, collecting a certain amount of orbs will make the mutant transform and turn into a stronger version of itself, which does to a degree incentivize picking up orbs, but once you've done that, there's absolutely no reason to confront enemies rather than just jump over them, walk past them, or damage boost through them. And without getting into fights with enemies, there's no reason to then pick up Wumpa Fruit for health. The game is split up into multiple different areas which all house a bunch of stages and a boss, and each area has literally like 8 stages that have almost no variation between them. If you showed me multiple stages from the same area, I would have no idea which was which. It's honestly ridiculous, and it's one of the most in-your-face examples of padding I've ever seen. At least with Crash of the Titans, I can tell that somebody tried, but here, it's just a bunch of random stage assets thrown together with no sense of purpose other than, okay, we made this level long enough, let's start on the next one. After you get through the 20,000 stages in each world, you face off against a boss, which can range from incredibly cheap to the point where I want to rip my hair out, to way too easy to stunlock and cheese. There's quite literally nothing of value to talk about with this one. I wish this was hyperbole, but I genuinely think this is a legitimate cash grab with almost no effort put into it whatsoever. A crash grab, if you will. If you grew up with this and is something you have nostalgia for, by all means, I'm not going to tell you what to like, but this kind of lazy garbage is honestly inexcusable to me. I'm mad I played it. If it wasn't for the fact that I'm going in order of release, I'd have put this way earlier in the video because wow, is this one anticlimactic. This game has literally no redeeming qualities that I can possibly think of. Even the music is repetitive. This isn't even the kind of game that's so bad it's good. You'd probably get more enjoyment crumpling up balls of paper and tossing them into the trash. Don't play this. Actually, play that trash can game with a copy of this game. Well, those are the 3 Crash Bandicoot games that came out for the DS. Despite the overwhelming success of the handheld, Crash had a pretty small and insignificant existence on it, especially when compared to all the games that came out for the GBA. You know, I usually try to be as positive as I can when I make these videos, and I typically find at least a couple good things to say, or have at least 1 or 2 games I could recommend checking out, even if they aren't all that great. But this time, the 3 games I've talked about today are legitimately not good, and the only one that's bearable to play, that being Crash of the Titans, still really isn't worth checking out for any reason, and it's pretty much just the lesser of 3 evils. These are all genuinely bad games, and such a miserable far cry from the quality Crash became popular for in the first place. Well, at least now I can get back to playing Crash 4, which is really good, by the way. Everybody go play it. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and you want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can click on. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.